got a list here today because the complacency among everyone is stark. The realisation that you need to actually do something and act and change your ways is literally about to smack you all in the face very, very hard. Because for years you thought this was politics, while those politicians undermined everything you were trying to pay off debts that they accumulated on your behalf. So I just want to slowly go through a list here. It might take some time. But this is a wake-up call. This is a do-or-die moment for you and your Commonwealth. You're allowing foreign interests to change your constitution. So this is literally a wake-up call. So we see this gaslighting from the government. And Albo keeps talking about housing while bringing in more immigration that housing can actually withstand. It can't put up with the stress that Albo has created on the economy on behalf of foreign interests that seek to undermine your constitution altogether. Now, Albo keeps rabbiting on about housing affordability, but we can look in the past here at ScoMo and their population agenda from 15 years ago. 15 years ago.
With urban sprawl, city congestion and the mining boom putting pressure on state and territory governments, there have been hopes that a new federal government population plan would find ways to deal with that. But the new strategy, released today after a year of work, has some accusing the government of being light on detail. While it outlines broad principles, the federal government is distancing itself from any targets pointing to where Australia's population might be headed. Brendan Trembath reports.
For Australians coping with worsening traffic and suburban sprawl, the projection that Australia's population would nearly double by the middle of the century was not what they wanted to hear.
I actually believe in a big Australia.
But then came a new Prime Minister and an election campaign fought on the urban fringes of the big capital cities, where squeezing in more people was not a popular option.
Let's take a breath and get it right. Let's not make as our national goal the goal of a big Australia. Let's make our national goal a sustainable Australia.
What that sustainable Australia would be was left to a new minister and a new national population strategy. Today, Tony Burke headed to the epicentre of Australia's urban growth, Queensland's Gold Coast, to outline what that strategy would be.
Once we get to the core of the economic drivers and making sure that we've got issues of infrastructure being able to be taken into account, and acknowledging that so much of the environmental footprint isn't about our total number, but it's about where we live and how we live.
The Minister is determined to avoid any population target or cap.
Sustainable Australia, sustainable communities. The right way to deal with population policy is not through an arbitrary and ultimately senseless debate about total numbers.
A cynical exercise in cutting and pasting previous government announcements and putting them in a glossy document does not amount to a sustainable population strategy. I mean, seriously, the Women's Weekly's royal wedding coverage, I think, only exceeds this document in terms of its commitment to glossy photos. 10% of the document is literally glossy full-page photos.
While the shadow immigration minister accuses the government of being light on detail, he doesn't want to commit to a population target either.
Coalition's very prepared to support policies that ensures a greater spread of the population and supports regional areas. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that that happens overnight, and we shouldn't kid ourselves that that absolves a government from the responsibility of seeking to manage things that were within its control, which is obviously the migration program.
The typical Australian are going to have less because there's the same size cake with more people sharing it, everyone gets less.
The philanthropist and entrepreneur Dick Smith made his first fortune selling consumer electronics. He rode waves of economic growth. Now he wants to get off.
I've benefited from the growthy economy without any doubt more than most people, but I've come to realise that it's going to destroy Australia and the world for our children and grandchildren.
Dick Smith does have a population target in mind, and he says where Australia is headed is unsustainable.
It's been claimed that we're going to go to 36 million or so. Wayne Goff says it's inevitable. Well, over my dead body, because I can tell you the quality of life for people then will be an absolute disaster. It's nothing but a downside now to go to more and more people in Australia, indeed to go to more and more people in the world.
The demographer Peter MacDonald from the Australian National University says the government's decision to avoid long-term targets is sound, but he says it could have tried to look a few years ahead.
I think it might have focused on population growth in the next decade at least, to be more specific about that, because I think in the next decade it's pretty clear that migration is going to remain relatively high. If we're going to have 250,000 new jobs in Australia each year, and the domestic labour supply will at best produce about 100,000 of those.
Professor MacDonald says the real driver of population growth is not government policy, but the state of the economy.
Throughout Australian history, migration has been driven by labour demand in Australia. And there are periods in Australia, and sometimes long periods in Australia, where migration was close to zero because there was very little labour demand in Australia, so, say in the 1930s, but also mid-1970s, early 1990s. But we're now in a period of very strong labour demand, and we can expect lots of migration as a result of that.
The Minister says even short-term predictions are difficult to make.
If you were to set targets 5 years ago, it would have been done without knowing anything that we're about to have a global financial crisis, nor understanding the implications of mining boom Mark II, where the dollar would end up, where our terms of trade would go.
Or whether the Australia of the future will need to be that big.
Brendan Trembath reporting.
And you're all wondering now what's going on while Rennick and Senator Roberts keep rabbiting on about the cost of living, because they've literally worked out they've got nothing else to rabbit on about. They won't charge anybody in relation to the in the arm. They won't step forward and put any of these criminal offences before the Australian Federal Police and stand up for their constitution. Instead, they would choose to terrorise you and gaslight you over the cost of living. So let's have a look at gold this week. Just this week alone, how many chunks has it gone up? Right, it's almost at 4,000 Australian dollars. Does that indicate to you that the government's winding out of its reserves? Maybe lost a few contracts with some Israelis? Interesting that. Who would be behind all of that? Would that be a debt machine behind all of that? So we look at this, and we look at this housing and this cost of living, and we look at the fact that Australians themselves have just sat on their asses, accepting it, putting up with it, waiting for it to arrive, instead of standing up in some sort of federal capacity that they might actually bless, that they might actually have over the top of a government that's driving them down into the ground with the oppression of a full militarised police force, as demonstrated here in Melbourne.
Fires, fights, flash grenades on city streets. Protests in the middle of Melbourne against an international weapons expo turned violent.
Get back!
So instead of sitting on your hands, your cost of living revolves around mainly three things. And this should now be a demand of this federal government under this arbitration that is cycling to an end for someone. They should demand that the electricity grid is returned back to the people and that the state manage that and charge the people for maintenance. The government should shut down all retailers of electricity and return the electricity grids to their former state-owned electricity grids. This means that private interests can't make money off the electricity grid. This means that the people should be able to use as much electricity as they require as the state uses the funds to continue to build the network. Charging people for the use of what they technically own as the owners of the Commonwealth, the naked owners under the blessing of Almighty God, deserve to have first use of the fruits as defined by the will of God. So this Australian government should see to closing down all retail electricity resellers and should look at the wholesale market for what it is and return it back to the people. The people should not pay for the use of their electricity network. The people should not have smart meters on their homes where oligarchies can determine what use they are allowed. Australians used to own these assets, and these assets should be returned to all Australians. This would relieve the burden on the economy, especially for those in small businesses that would seek to benefit the economy by creating that economy in the first place. Large industry shouldn't come under that whole entire commercial and residential electricity grid. These large industries require immense amounts of power to run and therefore should either create their own power networks or provide a large taxation to the government for the use of that state's power network. Pauline, Senator Rennick, Malcolm Roberts, Bar Betty, and so on. Let it be foreknown to you that the people want their electricity grid back and that foreign interests should not profit from what the people are. It is sweat labour, and this brings us to the next point. The use of the driver's licence is either a competency which proves that the people of this country are competent to operate a machine on the roads around everyone else, or it's a privilege deemed by the state against the people of this country, taking away a right to travel freely amongst the states as defined in the Constitution. The driver's licence is a way of the state keeping the free man as a ward of the state and using that instrument to debt collect for the state, putting sweat labour on the person identified on the driver's licence. So it is either a competency or it is defined as a privilege given by the state that is subordinate to a people united in a federal commonwealth, taking a right from those people, creating them into wards of state, and defining that right as a privilege to that ward. This whole entire ideology will stop. Pauline, Malcolm, you both know very clearly that as defined on the Supreme Court record, a line of authority is defined under the blessing of Almighty God into that Constitution. Keeping the people as slaves instead of making sure they are competent could be argued against what would be your sovereign, King Charles III, whom in his homeland allows people to hold that licence until they are 65, where they have to then go and be tested to reprove that they are competent. So if you are relying on a line of authority in a sovereign that already does these things in his homeland, then those things should occur in this land too. This brings us to registration of the motor vehicle. We know that the states are using these driver's licenses and registrations to inhibit the people from using their own land. Now, a lot of people won't remember going back to 1980s and earlier, where cars were divided between private and commercial, and private registration didn't have the impacts of that commercial registration. All of you are being treated in that commercial registration today because they removed the private registration from the registrar for all of you. It probably doesn't occur to all of them. It's class warfare where they treat you like the poor instead of the men and women united as a people in a federal Commonwealth, which stands over and above all of the decisions of your public service, your servants under the blessing of Almighty God. Those appointed as ministers and representatives of your parliaments, those under oath as police officers, and so forth. So we demand of this Australian government, under the blessing of Almighty God, united in a federal Commonwealth, to address this competency versus a privilege to use what is God's and a right to the first use of those fruits. The freedom to travel being one of those fruits that is inhibited by the state. Secondly is the registration shall be returned back to private and commercial, and those in private registration shouldn't be pulled over by the police and treated like they're in a commercial capacity. This is debt slavery. This is peonage. This is debt bondage. This is the states using police officers to enslave the people at the end of a gun, at the end of armed force. This makes it forced slavery, forced servitude. Let it be recognised that we see what you do, we see what you are, and we see what you've done. Now, lastly, let's just have a listen to Anne Bresington from quite some time ago, over a decade ago, warning all Australians while those career politicians laughed in her face while they dismantled your Commonwealth on behalf of foreign interests. So let's just have a listen quickly.
That Peter and members of Flag Australia and myself are hearing on a regular basis about the pressure that our farmers and food producers are under. But let me just make the point that these policies come from a faraway place. And you're going to have to bear with me now for a few minutes while I read my speech, and I will read it because otherwise I'll be up here for hours. I get a bit carried away with this, so I've contained it to as smaller speech as I can do. But we are in trouble, and we all need to pull together on this. And first of all, I'd just like to thank people who have been supporting Flag Australia in their push to get this word out there. At Leon Biner on his Don't Sell Australia Short Facebook campaign, who has now over 7,500 members, all concerned about the same thing. Sean Perry from 5AA Talkback, who has allowed Peter and myself many times to go on there for hours at a time to get these issues aired and discussed. And we'll actually be having Lord Monckton on there tomorrow night from 7 o'clock till midnight, so that people can ring in, ask questions and have a discussion about this. So 5AA have been behind us, which is great. And also the Southern Argus newspaper. They have been so supportive of getting the message out there of the stress that our primary producers are under, and we really can't thank all of those people enough. So now I'll start to read. Again, thank you all for coming here today. I also thank the many people behind the scenes who have helped to educate me on the global issues and how they are being implemented at a state level so that I can be an effective elected member of your parliament. And while I'm speaking to you today, I'm going to quote a number of people from various influential positions on the international stage. And I'll leave it with you to make up your mind if you want to continue to head in the direction that we're going. I first stumbled across Agenda 21 in about 2008, and quite frankly my first reaction was to dismiss what I was reading, because I didn't believe that any government in Australia would take us down this road. Then I began to see a legislative pattern emerging in Parliament which concerned me greatly, and I also started to see the tenor of legislation that we were passing. I did air those concerns in Parliament and it was dismissed and ignored. The words Agenda 21, ladies and gentlemen, were never meant to be spoken. And if they were, then of course it would be dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Because if people knew Agenda 21 and what it stood for, there's plenty of information out there where they could actually learn what the end game was, and governments didn't want that to be known. My dad always said to me that people only lie for two reasons. One reason is because you're ashamed of what you're doing, and the second reason is that you don't want people to be warned just before you screw them. And I honestly believe that these secrets have been, thank you, that these secrets have been kept for both of those reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, the origins of the environmental movement as we see it began back in 1968 when the Club of Rome was formed. The Club of Rome has been described as a crisis think tank which specialises in crisis creation. The main purpose of this think tank was to formulate a crisis that would unite the world and condition us to the idea of global solutions to local problems. In a document called The First Global Revolution, authored by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider, on pages 104 and 105, it stated, "In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers, of course, will be caused by human intervention that will require a global response." That's the origin of global warming, ladies and gentlemen. In 1975, Australia agreed to bring in a new economic order via the Lima Declaration on the Second Conference of the United Nations Industrial Development Organisation. The outcome of this was, as I said, the Lima Declaration, which was the blueprint for the redeployment of tools, jobs and manufacturing to the developing nations, leaving countries like Australia short of technology, a manufacturing base and jobs. Blind Freddie can now see what the outcome of that has been for our country, with their unworkable trade and tariffs agreements hand in hand with this that have followed as a matter of course. This is now a reality, with around 90% of our agriculture and manufacturing just gone. Australia signed the Lima Declaration and hundreds of others with the support of all major political players: Whitlam, Fraser, Hawke, Keating, Hewson, Howard, Rudd, the Democrats, the Greens and even the Nationals. It has been put to me that all of these treaties were the foundation for the rollout of Agenda 21, and it seems that Australia has been moved around the global chessboard, and our so-called leaders were either complicit or naive to the long-term consequences. And now we're almost at checkmate. In 1992, former President of the United States, George Bush Sr. said, "Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals, and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources. This shift will demand that a concern for the environmental consequences of every human action will be integrated into individual and collective decision-making at every level. Cutting through the code, I want everyone to consider what the words profound reorientation of all human society and unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources actually means. For everyone here tonight not familiar with Agenda 21, I would suggest that this is the beginning of your learning curve, not the end. In 1992, Maurice Strong, Secretary-General of the UN Earth Summit and member of the Club of Rome, said, "It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, use of fossil fuels, ownership of motor vehicles, small electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable." Put those statements together with the previous one, and it must become clear that Agenda 21 is about controlling every aspect of our lives: how we eat, what we eat, how much we eat, how we move around, food production, the amount of food, and where we even live. Dixie Ray, former Washington State Governor and Assistant Secretary for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, stated, "Agenda 21 seeks to establish a mechanism for transferring the wealth from citizens to the third world. Fear of environmental crisis would be used to create a world government and UN central direction." From a report in the 1976 UN's Habitat I conference, land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, therefore contributes to social injustice. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if you work hard and you exercise good financial management and invest in property, you are contributing to social injustice. In a report from the President's Council on Sustainable Development, we need a new collaborative decision process that leads to better decisions, more rapid change, and more sensible use of human, natural and financial resources in achieving our goals. And at the same time, Harvey Reuven, Vice Chair of the Wildlands Project, says individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective. J. Gary Lawrence, Advisor to President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development, participating in a UN advocated planning process would very likely bring out many of the conspiracy fixated groups and individuals in our society, and here we are. This segment of our society, who fear one world government and UN invasion, through which our individual freedoms will be stripped away, would actively work to defeat any elected official who joined the conspiracy by undertaking Agenda 21. So we will call our process something else. We will call it comprehensive planning or growth management or smart growth. We ended up with sustainable development. The redeployment of human and financial resources has now become visible to us all via the cut to services and programs to assist the sick, the young, the elderly, and of course the creation of another level of poverty now identified by the term the working poor. I was speaking to a person last week and he said to me, if Hitler was still around, he'd be sitting back thinking, I didn't need bullets for a global takeover. And he'd be right. We see daily cash grabbing via new taxes called levies, supposedly because we are cash strapped in this state, and at the same time see big project spending that does not fit with the message that we are in financial crisis. But we the people have to tighten our belt, while the government seems absolutely unaware and unconcerned of the amount of debt that it is accumulating. This in turn means that taxes, levies, fines and other penalties increase, as well as the cost of living rising exponentially, and the ordinary citizen's ability to exist well is compromised with almost every law that we pass. We're constantly paying for so-called services that we don't receive. This is wealth redistribution at the grassroots level, redeployment of financial resources, ensuring only hardship for the citizens who just really want to get on with their lives. The Parliament has also ventured into the rights of people to own and retain their property and manage it without government interference. In particular, the laws around, as Peter said, water allocation, natural resource management, the Native Vegetation Act, Development and Planning Act, which are all equally toxic to our food producers as they are to our long-term security, we city dwellers. Everyone needs to remember we all pay a natural resource management levy on our tax rates. So this is not just going to affect the food producers. The intrusions into our property that Peter was talking about that land producers are going through will roll out into the suburbs and into the city because they have the authority to do that. We all have already fiddled in Parliament with land titles of people in rural areas, and I'm talking about the Barossa and McLaren Vale legislation that passed. And the buzzwords used to justify that was heritage status. At the same time that our right to own and manage our land, have access to water, produce adequate food to ensure that our only option is not to consume often toxic and substandard food from places like China, this government has been working overtime to take away our rights to common law through many pieces of legislation. Common law is what guarantees us an ability to correct injustices. This coming year, I promise you, you will also hear debate over a number of pieces of legislation that will further erode our common law rights. And you have to get behind me on this, ladies and gentlemen, to stop this from going through. As Agenda 21 became more and more apparent to me, I began using the line in Parliament that government was now declaring war on its own citizens. And that goes back as far as 2008. This, of course, led me to being labelled a conspiracy theorist. But here we are now, openly talking about Agenda 21 and the ramifications we will see in a short period of time if this is not stopped in its tracks. Let me just say that I often hear we cannot stop what is happening. Two-party preferred system, vote Labor, vote Liberal, what does it matter? And in fact, that's probably true for the House of Assembly, because that's where government's formed. But ladies and gentlemen, here in South Australia we have the Legislative Council, the House of Review. And my friends, that is where the true power does lie. And the last thing that governments want you to understand is that no matter who is in power, the Legislative Council is there for checks and balances. And when the Legislative Council isn't overly influenced by the major parties, legislation can be blocked. Remember, on most of these policies that I've spoken about here today, there has been bipartisan support for everything that has gone through. When the major parties join together, then the crossbenchers and minor parties, basically our vote is null and void. The way to avoid that is to make sure that when the major parties do join together, they don't have the numbers. For way too long now, we the people have been asleep at the wheel, and it is time to wake up and participate in the democratic process. And to do that, you need to understand the parliamentary and political system that you are trying to rein in. In 1972, the Club of Rome published the alarmist Limits to Growth document, warning of worldwide overpopulation, the need for sustainable development. This was the beginning of the slow process of social engineering and programming people to accept that the planet is struggling to sustain life. On the 8th of October 1973, the New York Times reported a quote from Ted Turner, also Club of Rome. The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. In 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev, also a member of Club of Rome, said, "We are moving toward a new world order, the world of communism, and we shall never turn off that road." He also quoted in 1996 Monetary and Economic Review on page 5, "The environmental crisis will be the international disaster that will unlock the new world order, one world government." In 1992 came the Earth Summit, which produced the document called the Earth Charter. This document was co-written by Maurice Strong, long-time globalist, elitist, member of Club of Rome, and Mikhail Gorbachev. Both Strong and Gorbachev stated that it was hoped that this document would be adopted as the new 10 Commandments, with environmentalism as the new one world religion. Out of this summit came Agenda 21. Ted Turner, who was also a member of the Club of Rome, was quoted as saying in 1996, "The total population of 250 to 300 million people is ideal. That means a reduction of 95% from present levels would be even more ideal. Anyone who abhors the China one-child policy is simply a dum-dum." In 1998, the Baltimore Sun reported on July the 7th, most of Ted Turner's first donation to the UN of $22 million went to programs that seek to stall population. Another goal of the depopulation process is that the upcoming generation will submit to sterilisation to save Mother Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, everything I've said here tonight can be verified by document searches, and it is now time for us all to take off our blinkers and encourage our neighbours to take off their blinkers. And it's also time for you to demand that every person you elect fully understands this policy that is being rolled out via local, state and federal government at a concerning rate. We're not talking about decades, we're talking about only years before this is fully implemented. And every day another law is passed, is introduced to produce the endgame of Agenda 21 being fully implemented. So the question that Lord Monckton asks, carbon tax, climate change and Agenda 21, can democracy survive all three? Needs to be answered, and answered now. And you need to find out from your elected members what they know of Agenda 21, and if they don't know it, educate them. And if they don't know it, then push them to understand what they are voting on in Parliament, because this is crossroads. I thank you all very much for your time and for your attention, and I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce Lord Christopher Monckton.
Now, under the lineage of God, King and Country, government was formed under all of that, putting it under the people as that country, as the Engineers Case 1920 defines, that the people united in a federal commonwealth had won over the national parliament in power at law. So we point out under section 44 that these politicians have been dealing with foreign interests. This would be foreign interference into the Commonwealth of Australia by its constitution itself, which at section 44 defines politicians like Albanese who seek to undermine the blessing of Almighty God and replace it with some sort of dream time, to be outside of section 44 and in obedience or adherence to those foreign interests. So we look at the Australian Federal Police, who are unwilling to follow through with those charges that have been laid out before you as real criminal offences, and now ask of those in command of the military to look very clearly at that Brereton report and the actions of those in this Parliament going against section 44 of our very own Constitution. You have a power alongside us united in a federal Commonwealth, which stands over and above that of a national parliament. It is in your mind to know those international laws of armed conflict and see the crimes that are going on inside this parliament. Now, the egos and the comprehension amongst the general population is very, very low. And their ability to stand up and actually follow through with anything over the last 15 years has demonstrated to be lacking. They don't know how to write a letter. They don't know how to file in a courtroom. They don't even know how to report a crime properly. So it's about time all of you recognised your federal power over what is national and start to stand up and demand answers from your representatives in your local regions and start making those accusations of those criminal offences to the Australian Federal Police. If the Australian Federal Police refuse to act on international criminal offences, then we must demand of the armed forces to step up to their obligations in those Hague and Geneva conventions. They have obligations as defined by the Brereton Report. And this is where I'm asking all of you to stop watching videos and picking at answers and start uniting together as the towns and the people that you were and start demanding of those responsible to be responsible and accountable. The military has a responsibility in the Constitution. These politicians have a responsibility in the Constitution, as do all of you, the people who united in that federal Commonwealth to have won over that national government in the first place. So maybe you should put that red ensign outside and on your car and everywhere you go. And maybe you should start writing those letters of accusations to all of those politicians and the Australian Federal Police. Maybe you should make the Anglican Church aware. Maybe you should make all of your friends and colleagues aware. Maybe you should make all of the police and the military and the nurses and the doctors and everyone else that was affected by the state aware of why the state attacked them. Might be time for all of those doctors, nurses, police and military to look at why this was done to you and look at it as that international war crime that has occurred upon you. You in the military have an obligation under the blessing of Almighty God, regardless of what the government says about its defence and the government of the day. You are the people united in a federal Commonwealth that have a power over and above the national parliament. And it's about time you all realise this, instead of sitting on your hands all the time, waiting for a foreign interest to dismantle your government and take it away from you all. So everyone knows that as the sound of the government not giving a crap, right? The keeping you on hold forever sound. And everyone's probably been subjugated to it at some point in their life. So let's just have a quick look at Sky News before we close off.
Yet despite over 60% of Australians in every single state rejecting racial separatism, the Voice agenda is still being funded with your money and pushed by stealth. We have so-called truth-telling inquiries currently going on in both Queensland and Victoria, not to mention the growing hostility in many welcome to country ceremonies. Joining me now to discuss this, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Well, I thought we've got two big anniversaries about to land on us, and we need to stop and I think acknowledge where we are 12 months on. The first of those, Tony, is the voice. Australians spoke very, very loudly, but I feel certainly, and my viewers tell me, that it's just being forced upon us anyway. I mean, didn't our governments listen to us last year when we rejected all of this?
Well, they should have, but I don't believe they have, because when we rejected the voice, we were really rejecting the full Uluru agenda, which was voice, treaty and truth. At the moment, the government isn't talking about a voice anymore, but they're certainly encouraging their state Labor colleagues to get on with so-called treaty and so-called truth. Well, we are one country, we're not many nations, and you can't make treaties with yourselves. And our history is something that we should be proud of. It's not a history of shame. Sure, it's not perfect. And this idea that we should retell the story of Australia as one of shame is just absolutely and utterly wrong.
I know you've just come back from a conference overseas, but the Unley Council in South Australia just voted to reinstate its Australia Day events on January 26. You get a sense that the tide is turning. But then we've seen some quite divisive welcomes to country, anything but a welcome in recent times. And I think there is a growing mood amongst Australians, particularly post-Voice, to say enough of being welcome to our own country.
Well, as you know, Peter, I think that the country belongs to all of us, not just some of us. That's why I don't like these welcomes to country unless it's very specifically a welcome to a particular Indigenous event.
So you wouldn't have them at the AFL? Or...
No, and you certainly, fair enough if you're going to an Indigenous event, say welcome to the Pitjantjatjara lands or something like that. But the idea that everywhere you go, there should be an acknowledgement that it's not our country, but it's the Indigenous clans' country. The idea that every speaker should stand up and acknowledge country, this is really an act of abasement. It's basically a confession that we shouldn't have settled this country in the first place. And it's a recipe for national neurosis, and that's the last thing we need. I keep thinking of what Bob Hawke so wonderfully said on Bicentenary Day. This is a country with no privilege of origin. This is a country with no hierarchy of descent. And if Anthony Albanese wants to be the successor of Hawke, they're phrases he should remember.
Well, Hawke also famously said, if the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. I mean, 12 months on almost since those horrific events of October 7, I never imagined we would be in a situation where the scourge of anti-Semitism would be so entrenched, so institutionalised, so excused at the highest levels of our government as it is now.
And October the 9th, just a couple of days later, was our day of infamy when you had that crowd shouting unspeakable things in front of the Opera House. What worries me about all of this is that all too often our government is like a helpless bystander. We see these pro-Hamas demonstrators and our government say there's nothing they can do. We see these pro-Hamas encampments on universities and elsewhere. It's a public nuisance. It's trespass apart from anything else. And again, our institutions say there's nothing that they can or should do. Who knows what's going to happen in the Middle East with Iran and Israel at loggerheads. And all the Prime Minister can say is Australians should leave Lebanon. More helpless bystander stuff. Frankly, we should be sending one of our air warfare destroyers to the Red Sea.
So it's really up to all of you to stop infighting and stop abusing each other and trying to clamber on top of each other and find grace together. Instead of trying to be better than each other. Oh, I've got better law than he does. No, you're a country that's falling apart because that's all you've done for 20 years. So looking at what has come from 15 years ago to today, after being fully warned about it, to lead you here, getting out of fines and fighting rates and doing all of these zombie things and attacking each other and trying to find out who's got to write this and that, and all the while forgetting who you are as a people and not defending it and not standing up for it and not pointing out Section 44 and the foreign interests in the government. Remember how they all went to the High Court? 14 of them stood before the High Court over Section 44, and no one listened or cared about the actual line of authority into your Constitution in the very first place, which would define adherence, allegiance, obedience to anything foreign to that Constitution. And you've got senators pointing it out 11, 12 years ago. You've got me coming out of a council 15, 16 years ago and warning all of you very, very clearly what they were trying to undermine and do to all of you, Aborigine included. And this is where this government continues to use that line on behalf of foreign interests that have no interest in the Aborigine, that have no interests in the Constitution, have no interest in sovereignty, full stop. They want the minerals under our feet, and they're ours. First use of the fruits. And they've committed international war crimes across the board. And you have an opportunity to stand up as a people in your families under God as defined in that engineer's case. So go and read Numbers and think about Australia and think about defence and think about our coat of arms and think about our call to arms, a call to all of your families to finally rise up against what is a crime going in your Constitution right now, today, inside that Parliament, amongst multiple members of that Parliament, all operating for and on behalf of something outside of Section 44 of that very Constitution. So it's time to speak up. It's time to point it out. It's happening. It's real. It never ends because you all sit there waiting for answers instead of being the answer. So you can see by Sky News, you can see by the silence in the government over what's been put on the table, that they still intend on attacking you and pulling it apart. And you lot can't even see it while you sit on your hands, and you were warned in a book tomorrow when the war began. And you're just waiting for it to happen. You have no forethought for your families. You have no forethought for your country. You have no forethought for these politicians committing international war crimes and criminal offences within your own Commonwealth. You have no forethought to stand up to this. You have no forethought to speak up. You have no forethought to point out those criminals. You have no forethought to do anything. You sit on your hands complacently waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting until it's all gone.